The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, Water as Weapon, the New Age of Resource Conflict. Water has become one of the most strategic resources of the 21st century. Rivers and lakes are increasingly becoming flashpoints for international tension, with nations leveraging water scarcity to exert political and economic influence. How is the manipulation of water supply used as a weapon in modern conflicts, and what risks does upstream control create for downstream communities? How have technological innovations affected water warfare? And how effective are current efforts to resolve water-related disputes? To learn more about this important global issue, join our live debate to share your questions and comments with our expert panel.
And welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for this Democracy Forum debate, where twice a month we discuss and argue issues often overlooked by the mainstream media and commentariat. Today, water as a weapon, the new age of resource conflict. From India and Pakistan tensions over the Indus to attacks on water infrastructure in Ukraine, to China's control of rivers flowing from the roof of the world, water has to be an element of pressure, power, and conflict. But how much? To debate this, we have a superb panel of experts: Marcus King, Uttam, Sinha, and Gary Lewis. The Democracy Forum chair, Barry Gardiner, will be with us throughout and will sum up and possibly challenge at the end. And before any of that, I have the privilege to ask the Democracy Forum president, Lord Charles Bruce, to lay out the background and the canvas of our discussion. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, which highlights the leverage of water as a diplomatic tool and as a weapon of coercion. I am grateful to the team at TDF for including this important subject in our program and for inviting such an eminent panel of experts to participate. I'd like to thank each of them for agreeing to take part today, and I'd like to thank Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator. It is just over a year since the Indian government suspended the 1960 Indus Water Treaty, the day after a terrorist attack at Pahalgam in Kashmir on the 22nd of April. As a direct response to the terrorist outrage, the treaty was put into abeyance, conditional on Pakistan permanently ceasing its support for terrorism. But regardless of the heinous and cruelly targeted nature of the attack, which resulted in 26 civilian fatalities, suspension of the treaty in this manner by either signatory is unprecedented, as water is customarily considered to be out of bounds. As a paper published by Chatham House earlier last month observes, in effect, water has now become a diplomatic weapon between two nuclear powers, where India's decision to suspend the Indus Treaty, I quote, not only erodes the predictability and stability it had provided, but also underscores how water can exacerbate tensions and even be instrumentalized as a tool of conflict. Despite the potential seriousness of the precedent caused by this diplomatic standoff, it is unusual that a trans-boundary water agreement should be weaponized to this degree. But as several analysts concur, India appears to be leveraging the crisis now to renegotiate a pact it has long disliked. The diplomacy of water is monitored globally by geographers at Oregon State University. They have mapped over 800 water-based treaties emanating from 313 drainage basins, occupying a quarter of the Earth's surface, amounting to 60% of total freshwater flow and affecting 40% of the world's population. Whereas conflicts over water are widespread and inevitable and are sometimes intractable and violent, it is reckoned, however, that 2/3 of interactions are mostly cooperative. And data analyzed by the Pacific Institute of California reveals, however, that between 2019 and 2023, there were 100 and 91 water-related disputes in South Asia. I quote, "Barring the Middle East, no other region is so water fraught," concludes The Economist. Water management remains a messy patchwork of bilateral agreements that leave countries free to treat rivers as bargaining chips rather than as shared ecological systems. Indeed, as Mark Twain famously observed, "Whiskey's for drinking, water is for fighting." Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar this afternoon. And if you have any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Lord Bruce, thank you very much for that. Rivers as bargaining chips, water is for fighting. Our first panelist is Professor Marcus King from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and his present research focuses on identifying linkages between environmental change and societal instability in fragile states. His two most recent books mirror our debate, Water and Conflict in the Middle East and Weaponizing Water. So, water as a weapon, the new age of resource conflict. Marcus King, tell us what you know.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. My basic argument is that cooperation over water between states and other political entities has indeed been more common historically, but conditions are changing in certain ways toward more conflictual outcomes, especially at the subnational level. And one of these outcomes has been the weaponization of water. Lord Bruce just cited the same database that I would like to talk about a little bit, which was from University of Oregon, called the Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database. And indeed, they found cooperation over water outnumbers conflicts over water. So going from antiquity to 1984, there were 3,600 water agreements. But there were also some other findings that said water is never the single cause and rarely the major cause of international conflict. Water also most often results in verbal altercations between states, which I call bellicose rhetoric over water. So cooperation events outnumber conflict, not necessarily armed conflict, more than 2 to 1, as was said. But from antiquity to 1984, there were 507 conflictual events, and 37 of these events involved military actors. So there is some military action around this. And then also the Pacific Institute, which was Lord Bruce also cited, has found since 2020, on all different levels of analysis, there's been 1,428 conflicts over water. Again, many of them localized. But water as a weapon also goes back to antiquity. Control of water has always signified power. So in ancient Mesopotamia, for instance, we had what are called hydraulic civilizations, and they were referring to societies where political, economic, and social organization develops around control of water, especially large-scale irrigation, or control of dams and river management. Lagash and Umma in ancient Samaria had the first long-term war over water and irrigation that led to a century of conflict in 2500 BC. But recently, in academia, this theory has arisen called hydrohegemony. And hydrohegemic theory holds that hegemony at the river basin level is achieved through resource control strategies, such as resource capture, integration, treaties, and containment. So treaties themselves can be an expression of power or an expression of leverage over water issues. Hydrohegemony is power projection or using leverage, and it's seen in almost all shared water basins, but it's not necessarily armed conflict or even necessarily conflictual. So which ways can water be linked or extended to conflict and instability that I study? There's basically 3 ways. So the first is water can be a trigger of conflict. So unequal access, pollution, or droughts, or shared river issues could spark conflict. But in this role, normally water is an underlying grievance or a pressure point that then contributes to the instability. So for example, tensions rise between upstream and downstream states. Disagreement over dams, irrigation, or river flows can trigger conflict. But also, water can be a casualty or a target itself of conflict. So what I've studied is water bodies, water systems can be damaged intentionally or incidentally during war, but also water, as I really specialize in, can be used during the conflict of itself. So water can be a weapon during the conflict itself. Water as a weapon, therefore, can be deliberately used to harm the adversary. It could be used to cut off water supplies, flood territory, poison wells, and of course, manipulating dams or denying access to water itself on the battlefield. So transboundary water conflict tends to occur in what we call basins at risk or hydropolitical security complexes. And so these complexes involve states that are geographically part owners or technical users of rivers, and as a consequence, consider the rivers to be significant national security issues. And water has emerged as a critical flashpoint in this new age of resource conflict in international relations. One of the things I've written about is there's certain what I call harbingers of international water resource conflict on a basin. This would be the unilateral development of infrastructure, usually a dam. Another sign in many countries is rapid changes in precipitation, which can change the hydrological flows. Another issue related to instability can be weak societal institutions, especially water management regulations themselves. Existing animosities between states, as we see in the Indus River Treaty example, can also be a harbinger of conflict. But then finally, at sort of the top of this pyramid is a new factor, which I've been considering, which is climate change. But no two nations have fought a war exclusively over water, as the Transboundary Freshwater Debate database indicates, but some have come close. So a couple examples are Iraq and Syria, who had a conflict over the Euphrates River in 1975. Syria was filling the Tabqa Dam, reducing the flow of the Euphrates that reached Iraq. And there were both states moving troops to the borders. A more recent example, again, this goes back to what I call the bellicose rhetoric, is the Egypt and Ethiopia over the filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So that's not produced a direct military clash, but it's repeatedly raised fears that something could happen. So war has been discussed seriously between actors, but actual military action has so far been avoided through different instruments, avoided through diplomacy, regional constraints, or the actual difficulty to destroy or disable a dam without major consequences, as the Egyptians had threatened to do with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So, however, where armed conflict has taken place involves water being weaponized. Weaponization also, just like cooperation, is not new. Roman soldiers, when they took over villages, threw dead bodies of people vanquished down wells. During the Anglo-Dutch Wars, dikes and levees were manipulated against troop formations. And even the Allies bombing German dams during World War II is an example of water being used in armed conflict. But according to my book on water weaponization, weaponization has really occurred at this subnational level, and I've written about its use by violent extremist organizations, and indeed how much it does fit into their strategies. So my book explained that there are 6 types or 6 categories of water weaponization, which I'll go through quickly. I'm probably running out of time. So strategic weaponization is the use of water to destroy large areas or gain virtual control over population centers, that destroying in a dam could flood a city or a region. So just holding that out as a threat is a strategic use. And this was done to good effect by ISIS during the conflict in Syria and Iraq. Tactical weaponization is against military targets in the battle space itself. It's very narrow. It's for an immediate military advantage on the battlefield. And then the next few categories have to do with coercive weaponization. So this is done by actors to build political legitimacy through taxing water. Raising revenue for armed action is something that ISIS has already done. Just using it as a psychological tool during sieges by cutting off water pipes and supplies to the areas that are under siege. So this is a way of extorting or incentivizing populations through control of water. One thing I found is that water also is a very blunt instrument. It's a blunt weapon. So there's cases where attempting to manipulate water has caused collateral damage. This was seen in Zaporizhia in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, where basically the Russians, as we all know, hasn't been admitted, were the ones that breached the Zaporizhia dam, which then actually flowed down the river and inundated some of the Russian military formations that were on each side. So it's a weapon that's very hard at times to control. So I'll just leave you on my final point, which is I do believe that the water weapon is proliferating. We've seen, in addition to the Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, ISIS, which I studied, the Taliban have also manipulated water. We're seeing it moving across the Sahel from basically the east to the west. So new African geographies like Burkina Faso, Yemen are examples of where water is being weaponized. And so I'm just afraid that now it's becoming normalized as more nations are involved, and unfortunately including Israel in the Gaza situation. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. That was most illuminating. Just if you can clarify, when does the weaponizing of water become a war crime under the Geneva Convention? Is it if you bomb the water infrastructure or if you block off a river? Or do you have any idea about that?
Yeah, so the Geneva Convention Additional Protocol 2 prohibits the use of water against civilian infrastructure, as you said. So the deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure, including water, treatment facilities and dams, is specifically prohibited by the Geneva Conventions. The use of water as a weapon, as a tactic, could be seen as a violation of the Geneva Conventions, but it also violates something called the NMOD Treaty, the Environmental Modification Treaty, which prohibits the use of manipulation of the environment for military reasons.
So under international law, this what we're discussing now, weaponizing of water, is illegal.
Correct.
Okay. And one thing, Shelley Boynton says, at what point, amongst our audience, at what point does water deprivation change from being a tactic used in war, which you just mentioned, to an act of war itself?
Right. So being used as a tactic of war actually violates the laws of war itself to the extent that civilians are involved or harmed. So that would happen in many cases. Very rarely is it a tactic on the battlefield that does not also involve civilian populations.
Okay. So it's an act of war even by being a tactic.
Or an illegal act of war.
An illegal act of war by being tactic. Thank you. Stay with us because we will be coming back to you. We're now going to move specifically into the South Asian arena with Dr. Uttam Sinha of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. He is the managing editor of the Institute's flagship journal, Strategic Analysis, published by Routledge. He's worked with the Harvard Kennedy School, the London School of Economics, and the Oslo Peace Institute, among others. And one of his most recent books is Trial by Water, Indus Basin and India-Pakistan Relations. These are two hostile nuclear-armed nations. Dr. Sinha, how are they using water as a weapon and how dangerous is it? Give us your thoughts.
Well, let me begin with a simple proposition. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Generally, when political relations turn adversarial, almost anything can be turned into a weapon. But we need to be a little careful with that word weapon because it can mislead us. And to particularly describe water in those terms risks letting the metaphor do more than the reality can sustain. The real question is not whether water can be weaponized, but whether it has the distinctive qualities that make it an effective instrument of power, or whether its physical limits make it far less usable than we assume. So, come to think of it, a weapon in the classical sense implies the ability to inflict direct, decisive harm, to compel outcomes. Water doesn't quite do that. Rivers can't be switched on and off at will, and we've seen this in the India-Pakistan context. They cannot be stockpiled. You have to build these structures of water storage. They cannot be redirected with precisions, right? And any attempt to deny water to others carries cost and risks for the users itself. So in that strict sense, even if you want to use water as a weapon, it turns out to be a rather poor instrument of war. And I think this is important, that it does not mean that it lacks strategic significance. Because as we've seen, between cooperation and conflict, there is this wide gray zone, a space where states are not quite at war, but not quite at peace either. And in that space, influence is not exercised through force. It is exercised through pressure and signaling and the manipulation of vulnerability. And this is where I think, and in my study, transboundary water begins to matter in this gray zone. Its influence is not direct. It is far more constrained. And it works through timing, through great degree of uncertainty, and through dependence, which is why water cannot be used to win conflicts. But increasingly, as we are seeing, especially in the 21st century, water is being used to shape them. Right? And that, I think, is a remarkable, a distinct shift that we're witnessing today between countries like India and Pakistan, between, to some extent, between India and Bangladesh, and to also a large extent, India and China. For much of the last century, that is, the 20th century, and all these data were just presented, shared rivers were managed within a framework, of engineering, optimism, and political restraint. The Indus Waters Treaty was negotiated for 8 years before it eventually was signed. It was water for peace, just like atoms for peace. These doctrines were quite prevalent during the Cold War. These were Eisenhower's doctrines there. So agreements such as the Indus Waters Treaty showed that even adversarial states could sustain cooperation over water. But that framework, unfortunately, you would all agree, is now under serious strain. There are a few forces which are converging to make this framework weak. First, I think, is climate change is altering the very hydrology on which these agreements were built. Glacial melt, erratic monsoons, extreme weather events are turning relatively those predictable river systems into volatile ones with a great deal of uncertainty. Ironically, the agreements and treaties designed for stability are now being tested by uncertainty, and this is very much the case in South Asia. Second, water infrastructure projects have changed the balance of control. Dams, reservoirs, diversion projects are creating asymmetries of timing and flow of water. Again, we see that this rapid advancement of these infrastructures in South Asia, and in particular in China itself, it's not how much water you can retain or release. What matters is when you do it. And South Asia is, witnesses a lot of dry season period. And that's the period where, the water criticality becomes very, very important. And this then becomes a huge strategic asset that can be, from time to time, depending on the strength of the country, be translated into political leverage and bargaining with the downstream neighboring country. It creates what the Marxist political philosopher Antonio Gramsci termed, a mix of force and consent. It might not give you absolute control, but it goes and it does create space for influence. And we see this dynamics across regions, not only the Indus Basin, but Mekong in particular, with China, and the disputes such as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It's very interesting to see how things play out there. And the third force that is coming together, and perhaps most importantly, is that water is becoming deeply politicized. Water is no longer treated as a purely technical issue, like it was to a great extent in the 20th century. It is entangled with nationalism, sovereignty, domestic pressures. And in that kind of ecosystem, even routine hydrological decisions begin to acquire a strategic meaning. So water has become immensely political, divisive, and very strongly emotive, as we see in countries in South Asia. So what does this mean in practice? Because that is what policymakers are asking us. What does it mean? How do we resolve this issue? How do we minimize the tension that might erupt? It means that water is unlikely, in my study, it's unlikely to be used as a weapon of outright aggression. The costs are too high and the consequences too unpredictable. So you got to trust your weapons and your missiles and your drones for war. But I think it will be increasingly used as a tool of pressure, to signal resolve, or to shape negotiations, and to remind the other side, the downstream country, of the structural dependence that they have. And this is where the real risk lies, not in dramatic scenarios of water wars, but in this gradual erosion of cooperative norms that exist between states. Trust is declining. Every dam you build becomes a suspect. Every floodwater you release in the flood season looks like a provocation. And technical disagreements are becoming harder to contain. The danger, I think, is not that water will trigger conflict on its own, and we've heard previous speakers say this, but that it will amplify existing tensions, making crises harder to manage and easier to escalate. So how should we think about the future, this future in the 21st century, where water is becoming a very central feature of state relationship? First, I think it's important to go beyond the binary of cooperation versus conflict. Rivers will increasingly be sites of both. There will be cooperation and there will be conflict. The task is not to eliminate competition, but to manage it. Second, I think existing agreements, the agreements that we've had in the past, need to adapt. They need to adapt to climate-stressed world. And that does not necessarily mean renegotiation. You can have renegotiation, jolly good, if the political climate exists. But what it means is that you've got to get the diplomacy and the dialogue going. There has to be greater degree of flexibility. And importantly, I think better data sharing and stronger dispute resolution mechanisms. Because the future, I think, is not going to be war over water, but there's going to be number of disputes that will erupt. Third, we need to recognize that transparency itself is now strategic. In an era of mistrust that we see, credible data on flows and users is a stabilizing factor. And finally, we should resist this temptation to describe water simply as a weapon. I began with that, and I'll try to reinforce that. Simply as a weapon, if you look at water, I think that overstates what it can do. But we have to be a little circumspect, but it also understates the risk it carries. I think that, for me, is a very important element of how I look at water, and in particularly in South Asia. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Could you just, because we were talking about the international law on this, and there's a question coming up, and the political elements of it. What does the law say about the sharing of water between national boundaries? Is there a one-line element that it must be shared, or it cannot be, withheld?
Well, the line that defines the sharing is equitable and reasonable sharing of water. Also, there is a lot of stress on the upper riparian. The upper riparian countries need to behave responsibly. They need to take care of the needs and the emotions and the requirements of the lower riparian. There is something called no significant harm. So I think the upper riparian countries need to follow those principles. And I think these are defined largely by, as I said, transparency, data sharing, etc., etc.
So, and what does it, and just sum up for us the Indus Treaty, what does that say should happen?
Well, at this moment, the Indus Treaty is in abeyance,
But when it was agreed, what does it say, and what is the impact of the abeyance?
Well, it was agreed in 1960. It was because of the partition that happened in 1947. So, the land was divided, and therefore you need to have a sort of a mechanism around the rivers that was being shared between two sovereign countries now. Earlier, there was no sovereign countries, so it was one unitary basin. So now when you had two countries, then you had to really resolve this issue.
Okay.
It was not so much about water sharing as it was about dividing the basin. So you had three eastern rivers, they were called the Punjab rivers, and there were the three western rivers, which were called the Kashmir rivers.
Okay. So is India in breach of international law by suspending this treaty and politicizing the water element?
Well, no, I don't think so. India has engaged in what is quite clearly a unilateral action, which goes, of course, against the spirit of the treaty. But I think it defines its unilateral action very well. It is now what it described as a conditional framework. Cooperation can only happen when the cross-border terrorism stops from Pakistan. And I think it, in that sense, has become, what is called, in certain sense, conditional interdependence. That there has to be a certain degree of responsibility of lower riparian countries like Pakistan itself. And there is, therefore, a very strong messaging here that the treaty is not abrogated, by the way. It can be revived. But reviving that treaty, there has to be a good behavior from Pakistan,
which is separate from the water issue. It's a good behavior on sponsoring terrorism or whatever is alleged.
I think terrorism is now quite clearly linked to the water sharing issue.
Yes, which is
now very political.
So Anand Singh Tomar is reflecting my own curiosity on this. How does India's temporary suspension reframe the legal understanding of the Indus Water Treaty under international law?
Well, I think abeyance is strategic ambiguity. It keeps the door open. It avoids the finality of abrogation. So it preserves a degree of diplomatic flexibility. Yet international legal institutions don't generally tend to accept this ambiguity at face value. The Court of Arbitration has ruled that India's abeyance does not suspend the dispute settlement mechanism. But India has been very clear to say that they have done a unilateral act here by putting the treaty in abeyance. And when you are on the road of unilateralism, legality unfortunately does not matter.
Can I just bring Marcus King back here, if you're with us, Marcus, on this element of international law? Do you agree that it is not a breach of international law, or do you think it's leaning towards that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I had believed that the Court of Arbitration, hadn't they ruled that the abeyance by India was not lawful, I think.
Okay. So it's not. Thank you. I just wanted to nail that down before we move on, and we will come back to you both. Thank you very much. We're just going to take a very, very short break and then on to Professor Gary Lewis, our third panelist. Thank you and welcome back. Our third panelist in this fascinating discussion that is rolling on is Professor Gary Lewis with the Institute for Water, Environment and Health at the United Nations University. He's had many decades of experience in international development, including with the as UNDP representative in Iran, and many years with the Office on Drugs and Crime. So Gary Lewis, join the dots for us. Iran, South Asia, Africa, the Sahel, all of these places where you've worked. Water as a weapon, the new age of resource conflict. Where do we stand?
Thanks. And thanks for the opportunity. I'd like to try to do that. And I'll do that by actually staying away from something that's mentioned in the the title, Water as a Weapon, a New Age of Resource Conflict, I'm like, one of the other panelists, I'm not convinced that water as a weapon is a useful way of framing these issues. Therefore, if you'll permit, I'd like to broaden the discussion and talk about the fact that water is I believe, going to be probably the most contested shared resource in the 21st century. And I don't say that lightly. I think we're going to see a significant demand increase for water. And I believe that the global architecture for managing water is simply nowhere near where it needs to be. I'd go further. One of the other panelists mentioned, in fact, both of them did, climate change. That's where I'd like to situate most of what I say. And that's going to, that would involve me saying that I believe that climate change will be the greatest threat to world peace and security in the 21st century. And in that context, climate change, and specifically water, I see it more as a threat multiplier, more as a crisis amplifier, and more as a risk accelerator. It's one of three main resource pathways, I believe, that will lead to insecurity or security if it's properly handled. And I'm talking about human security as opposed to military security. So you have water, yes, food, energy, and of course, what a mismanagement of those elements will produce, which is distress migration. And that is going to drive things in the wrong direction. I'm going to spend the rest of the 6 minutes that have been allotted talking about water generally. Then I'll use those three examples, those three continents, Africa, Iran, Asia, and the Middle East, to amplify what I'm trying to convey. First thing is that the impact of climate change is going to produce a scarcity of water in some cases and an overabundance of water in other cases. You're talking about floods and droughts and unpredictable rainfall, producing freshwater shortages. And then on the overabundance side, you're really talking about glacial melt and the impact that that's going to have downstream. But that's the environmental exposure on one hand. On the other hand, you've got a situation with state fragility. Is the state in which these water pressures coming, is that capable of handling it? The way that the state acts, will it undermine or strengthen its legitimacy or its efficacy and its resilience? These are things that together will decide whether you get a significant increase in protests, in strikes, in riots, the fomenting of violent extremism, the expansion of ungoverned spaces in a state, and possibly leading to the issue of how these pressures contribute to war. In terms of water itself, I'd say three things. First thing is the world has a water crisis. The world has a water crisis. Here are four stats that I'll just share with you and our audience to digest. 1 in 4 people is living in a country where there is water scarcity for between 4 and 6 months a year. First point. Second point, 1 in 2 people is living in a country where water stress is part of their reality for 1 month a year. Third point, 1 in 4 people lack access to safe water for drinking. And the fourth of the points on water is that by 2030, the United Nations estimates that we will have a shortage of 40% of fresh water. That's the first point. Second point, we don't really have an effective global architecture for managing water. Mention has been made to river basin treaties and so forth, but in reality, in terms of the 300-odd transboundary basins that we have on the planet, 70% of them have no dispute mechanism. The third and most critical point is how climate change is driving all this. So I'd like to use here to talk about my 3 examples. The first of them is in the Sahel, the 1,000 kilometer corridor that stretches from East to West Africa, or almost to all of East Africa. What you have here is a situation where, and this has been written about by Professor Marcus King in his various works, especially 10 years ago, the strategy whereby entities like Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin are expanding their their strategy for territorial acquisition. It's happening right now in Mali, central and southern Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And what happens is that this non-state armed group will move into an area and control water sources and establish a sort of a proto-government, settle disputes, and then use that to recruit from neglected communities, either among the farmers or the herders. So that's water as a risk accelerator. Second example, Iran. As you mentioned, I spent 5 years in Iran with the United Nations. And I can tell you that, I'll repeat what I said at the time, that was about 10 years ago, that I believe that water is the greatest human security threat right now in Iran. And I'm very much aware that there is an ongoing war. And so whatever the outcome of that particular conflict, I believe that water will remain the main security concern. The country is essentially water bankrupt. Depending on what numbers you look at, you're talking about a deficit of between 10 and 20 billion cubic meters of water per year. That is not sustainable. It's largely a result of the water mafia and bad water mismanagement during the years and the hydropolitics that's going on there. Not so much climate change, although climate change is a factor and will become an increasing one. What really worries me is not only that we're seeing protests as a result of a shortage of water, like what happened in Khuzestan in 21 and Isfahan last year, and this year, the riots that were taking place around January, they were driven significantly by water. But I see a comparison between what's happening there and the situation in Syria a decade and a half ago, where prolonged drought, groundwater depletion, rural collapse and migration to cities have prompted a situation that became very unstable and ultimately resulted in a lot of conflict. And right now, the exposure that the Iranian authorities have in terms of the conflict that's ongoing with their water exposures is incredible. Electric grid collapses, and especially as you move towards the hot and dry summer, there are some real issues with regard to the capacity of the country to respond. So that's your water as a crisis amplifier. And the last and short example I would use is something that's been talked about by everyone. And that's the situation in South Asia, which in my view is arguably the most dangerous water security scenario we have on this planet. You've got extreme weather, water scarcity, and glacial retreat. That's not been mentioned so far, but that's an important dimension because most of the water for the Indus, almost all of it, in fact, is coming from Kashmir area. And as the glaciers retreat, you're going to start to see much more spring and summer flooding. And then as the century wears on and the glaciers melt away, you're going to have much greater degree of scarcity with the result that you've got potential agricultural collapse for a part of the world that's relatively, depending on how you count it, I mean, all of South Asia, 2 billion people. And you have a situation where two countries that have a degree of historical enmity, they have an adversarial relationship, one that's significantly characterized by mistrust. I've lived in both and worked in both countries, by the way. What could go wrong? Water as a threat multiplier. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much there. On the Iran thing, just picking up that the United States that is at war with Iran at the moment knows about this water crisis that it's got. Would it be factoring that in as one of the reasons to break the regime? And if so, where would that stand in international law?
I think the other colleagues have spoken in response to questions from yourself and the audience on the international law dimension. I wouldn't want to nibble back at that. What I will tell you is that I mean, I said 5 years lived and traveled to all the provinces. You've got a situation where, you've asked me about the military planning. I'm not a military planner, but I would think any common sense observer would realize that according to operational military standards, combat effectiveness collapses without water. And you have probably a requirement for 15, I would guess 15 to 20 liters a day for hydration, for soldiers, basically, for hydration, hygiene, cooking, cooling, medical. And you've got between 500,000 and 1 million soldiers, military personnel in Iran, 300,000 Sepah, or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. You've got about the same amount in Artesh, which is the regular military, and you've got about 500, 600,000 Basij, which is the militia associated with Sepah. If these individuals can't access water, they become non-functional.
Thank you for that. I just a question from Daksh Kumar, and I don't know the relevancy, so I'll say, what impact will the massive AI-driven demand for water have for both developed and developing countries? Is this a factor?
I think so. I think so, because with the AI data centers, you're going to have an immense increase in demand for power, and in a number of countries, that power comes from hydropower, which relies on river systems and dams and lakes to produce it. So that is definitely that's definitely one dimension that's important. But I think we can also look at the AI dimension from the point of view of how it can be used to identify, for example, leaks in irrigation systems and areas where we can sow terrestrial and underwater.
So there's an AI plus and minus there. What I'd like to do now, I've got two more questions in from the audience, sort of capture my attention. I'd like to wrap them into one issue and open up to the to the panel again to just go around and get your thoughts on them. One of them is from Rashid Ali. Are most water conflicts really about mismanagement and political greed rather than physical shortage? And Margaret Barry, who's sort of making a point, are national interests likely to overshadow collective solutions when it comes to resolving water issues, particularly in the light, I think, at the moment that we've got with the populism and the national interest on the increase. Your thoughts on that, Marcus King?
Yeah, so I think that mismanagement is water mismanagement when it comes to situations globally with water conflict seems to be necessary but not sufficient. So almost every example that I've looked at has to do with some degree of water mismanagement. So an example would be the Syrian civil war, which many say was sparked by where water acted as a trigger, but also it was the Assad regime whose mismanagement and privileging of the Alawite minority over the Shia majority when it came to the provision of water, when it came to open irrigation, was something that came along, and it was an instability accelerant in that case. So I'd say that the caller is right to identify water mismanagement as a variable that's almost always there.
Okay, that's and just about getting back on this international law thing. Given that international law is being broken all over the place at the moment, am I wrong to be interested in this, or is international law a factor when we're talking about water conflict?
So my particular experience really shows that it is subnational actors that have weaponized water, at least in the way that I characterize weaponization. And so the problem is that violent extremist organizations, belligerents in civil war or insurgents, they just don't adhere to international law. So in this case, we're not getting, a very, very large percentage of those that are perpetrating these crimes.
Yeah, so it's even more irrelevant than it is when you're talking about nation states. Uttam, Sinha, on the mismanagement of water and the national interests, your thoughts?
Well, I think both matter, the mismanagement and also the physical scarcity. I think both are sort of intrinsically linked. The mismanagement, I think, is a kind of a trigger, while the physical scarcity, sets the larger stage. I would think physical scarcity is happening. Flows are declining, There is population growth. If you look at these basins, it is going through dramatic changes, climate variability. These generate the structural pressures, and create underlying stresses. And that also then impacts the institutional mechanisms and the treaties and the agreements that have come about. Mismanagement, there's a great deal of that in many of the basins in South Asia.
Yeah.
Poor allocation.
And do you agree with Gary Lewis that South Asia is the most critical region at the moment for water problems?
Indeed, I think. But again, the irony is that South Asian countries have treaties and agreements where very few of such kind of mechanism exists. So while there are political tension, there are also bilateral mechanisms. And what these mechanisms need to do is to just update themselves through dialogue and diplomacy and work towards a much more rational and collective understanding of the issues of water. So there's a bit of an irony because it's always been politically tense, South Asia. And it's remarkable that despite the tensions, you have these long-standing treaties and agreements, whether it's with India and Pakistan or whether it's with India, Nepal, and India and Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh renewed the treaty.
Yes. Yes, so that's Gary Lewis. Do you agree with that that scenario?
Generally, what I'd like to say is two things with regard to water mismanagement. I mean, I could take us back and look a little bit more closely at the situation in Iran, where for the past 3-4 decades, in fact, even from the time of the Shah, but especially recently, the water mafia, which is essentially and driven by the Revolutionary Guard's network of political, military, and business officials that have profited from dam projects and interbasin water transfers and agricultural expansion, that has crippled the country's ability to manage its water, which centuries ago was managed extremely well through a system of underwater qanats that have been fallen into this. So the issue of water mismanagement is really important. And what I said also about the absence of a global architecture to share the water that we have that remains, I think that's something that needs to be worked on. We've got a global water conference coming up at the end of this year, co-hosted by UAE and Senegal. I'm very much hoping that some clarity and result can come from that, especially in terms of enforcing water standards. If you'll allow me to just talk about the point which your second questioner asked about, was it national interests?
Yes.
I'd say I would not be looking right now, given, as you say, Mr. Hawksley, the way in which international law and international humanitarian law has been sidelined. I would be looking rather for leadership, and I would ask the question. I mean, I've heard this. It's not my idea, but I'd like to share it now. There is right now a climate paradox, whereby we know more and more about the extent and nature and pattern of the threat that climate change and nature loss is placing on our planet. And yet the leadership of the planet is engaged in a much more diminished manner than it was a decade ago. How do we explain that, first of all, and how do we turn it around? Thanks.
Thank you. No, that's really interesting points to finish with. And now we are going to the Democracy Forum chair, Barry Gardiner, Member of Parliament, who has prized himself away from the leadership arguments within Britain's ruling party to assess the quality of our debate. Barry, over to you.
Humphrey, thank you. And thank you to our three excellent speakers. Let me just tell you that this morning I was actually in a roundtable debate on water framework and water shortage in the UK, where we are facing a 5 billion litre per day deficit in public water supplies by 2055. So this is not unique to the Sahel. It is not unique to Asia or sub-Saharan Africa. It is something that we all face. And I think that will bring me back very nicely towards the end of my remarks to the question about governance, which I think is absolutely critical in all of this. We started with Charles quoting the the Indus Water Treaty, and speaking about what had happened post Pahalgam. He called it a messy patchwork of bilateral agreements around the world in relation to water. Marcus King, I felt in a sense, poor Marcus, Charles had eaten some of his lunch, because he also spoke about the University of Oregon database, the cooperation that has historically been more common, but that is beginning to change. And he spoke of 3,600 water agreements, but not as them being a single or major cause of conflict. Although he did cite 500 conflict events that had something to do with water. But critically, he said water equals power. He spoke about the hydraulic civilizations and hydrohegemony, and treaties that use water as leverage. He spoke of water as 3 T's: water as a trigger of conflict, water as tension between states and actors, and water as a target. And of course, at that point, every good Englishman would go into whistling the Dam Busters theme tune, which many of us grew up with the movie of. He also spoke about the cutting off supplies, the poisoning of wells, how historically we'd seen this, whether it was Roman soldiers throwing dead bodies down wells, whether it was the Anglo-Dutch use of the levees. And he singled out what he referred to as the new factor in all of this, being climate change. He identified the Iraq and Syria conflict over the Euphrates in 1975 and the Egypt and Ethiopian conflict over the Grand Ethiopian Dam. He also identified the way in which taxing water by rebel or organizations, sub-state actors, terrorist organizations like ISIS and others have done. But ultimately, I think concluded that water was a blunt weapon, referring back to our title, Water as a Weapon. He said it was a blunt weapon, and he cited, I thought very effectively, the instance of Zaporizhia, where Russian blew the dam, but only succeeded in flooding their own military positions. Now, again, Uttam Sinha picked up that theme of how it is a blunt weapon, and he spoke about how denying it to others carries costs for yourself. He didn't deny that it had significant force, but he said it was indirect influence. It was a means of applying pressure. And again, he spoke of the Indus Water Treaty as the water for peace, to show that even adversarial states could sustain cooperation over something like water. He then identified 3 things. One, again, we came back to climate change. He spoke of water infrastructure changes in dams and reservoirs, being able to give political leverage at specific times, and the use of it being very, very precise to get the appropriate leverage. He said now it's not purely technical, but has this political dimension. And it could also have, I think, what he called national importance, national significance. So water, he said, not used for outright aggression, but to remind the other side of their interdependency. And I thought he spoke very powerfully about the gradual erosion of international trust and cooperation. We've been speaking about that in these seminars for many weeks now, and the need to adapt to a climate-stressed world, stronger dispute resolution mechanisms required. And he also said, in an era of distrust, data and transparency then become uncertain. He spoke about the responsibility of the Upper Riparian Party, the Indus Treaty being an abeyance, but at partition being about just a division of whose was what and what the responsibilities were. We then got into the issue of, has India broken international law in some way? Conditional framework, diplomatic flexibility was a phrase thrown around at this stage. But I think we found that the Court of Arbitration had actually said, look, it's not lawful. It is a breach of international law. Saying, well, it is a conditional framework is a very polite way of saying we're going to break the treaty if you don't do what we say. Now, I like the way Professor Lewis turned the conversation and said, look, let's not focus so much on whether this is a weapon or not. Let's broaden the discussion out. He said water will be the most contested item in the 21st century, but he said climate is our greatest threat. And water is simply a threat multiplier or, interestingly, a security enhancer. He spoke about the differential impacts of drought and flood, the real importance, certainly in India and South Asia, of the glacial melt and the way in which climate change is changing the hydraulics of the region, or rather the hydrology of the region. And he then came back to that word, governance. It's about how the state manages governance. He said a water crisis already exists. He cited figures about 25% of the global population experiencing water scarcity for between 4 and 6 months of the year. Again, cited other examples. In Iran, the deficit of 10 to 30 cubic meters of water per year per person, and spoke about Syria's groundwater depletion being the source of conflict. Combat ineffectiveness or effectiveness collapsing without water. And we then got on to data centers. Now, data centers take up to 19 million litres of water per day. This is one of the figures we were discussing this morning in our roundtable. One of the interesting things to me was here in the southeast of England, where we have some of the best agricultural land, yet we have planned 10 new AI centres. And yet it is the area of the country which has the greatest water shortage. In fact, per person, per capita, it has less water than the Sahel per capita, because it is so overpopulated. And this, I think, gets us to the real issue of governance. It is about land use planning. It is about strategic water frameworks being developed. And it's really important that with those, there is democratic input and that there is transparency. And unless that governance is there, unless we have a strategic framework within which we regard water as, in effect, the sine qua non of all our other economic activity. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about house building or whether we're talking about industry, manufacturing, or technology, agriculture, everything that the state does and depends on for its revenues actually depends on water. That is why it is such a threat multiplier. That is why it exerts such leverage. And that's why I think that the professor was absolutely right to say that this is an aspect of the changing climate where we will have increased drought, but also increased rainfall in many parts of the world, that the new ways in which we have to manage water as a resource is one of the great challenges that we face in the 21st century.
Barry, thank you very much for that summing up. You've told me that we have less water than the Sahel here. That rather worries me, but
Per capita.
Per capita
in that part of England.
Back to the panel for our final thoughts. Water as a weapon, the new age of resource conflict. If you want to push back on anything Barry has said, feel free, but very short, please. Marcus King.
Yeah, I just wanted to start quickly on a concept that hadn't come up, and I thought probably would, which is just desalination. With desalination, it's really changed the vulnerability profile of states, especially in the current conflict in the Middle East. So these facilities are vulnerable not only to attacks on their facilities themselves, but due to the power that they demand. So it's been a new vulnerability in that water energy nexus. And then, sorry.
No, I was going to say that because we're running short of time. Another quick point, if you have it.
Oh yeah, just to agree with Dr. Lewis, that climate change is, through all of its effects, including precipitation change, drought, desertification, is really expanding the footprint of how water can be weaponized and where it can be weaponized.
Okay. Thank you for that. Uttam Sinha.
Well, I'll re-emphasize, water is rarely a weapon in the conventional sense. It's too unpredictable. I'll use the word blunt, as has been used earlier. But it is increasingly a source of leverage. States are not attacking with water. They are actually using control over timing, over flow, and the infrastructure to signal intent and shape behavior. So water is becoming subtler, more pervasive, and form a strategic pressure.
Thank you very much. Gary Lewis? Gary Lewis, are you muted?
I am indeed. Thank you very much, sir. It does happen. At one point in my intervention, I used the phrase human security. And I'd like to dwell on that a little bit, because I believe that we really need to recalibrate our way of thinking about security, because the referent points of security, I believe, have changed, as have the sources of insecurity and the policy tools that are required. I believe it's no longer sufficient to position security as a state-centric and militarized issue. And given what I said about climate change and nature loss, I believe that national interest now can no longer be defined without regard to the biosphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It is a great summing up from our three panelists. And Time's Winged Chariot is now attacking. So thank you, Marcus King, Uttam Sinha, and Gary Lewis. And thank you all at the Democracy Forum for making this really important and interesting debate happen. Our next Democracy Forum debate is May the 26th, after Iran, a new US-China relationship. And no question mark there, particularly as the American and Chinese presidents are meeting this week. So until then, for all of us at the Democracy Forum, stay safe and goodbye.
Can I ask?
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organization founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists, and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Done.
Well done, everybody. Thank you, Barry. Is there a vote for leadership, or how does it work?
Not yet. We need 81 of my colleagues to nominate one.
Wait.